Thank you, Anthony. A small word of advice. If any of you want to come up to me afterwards and say, Mr. Hitchens, from what I could hear, that was very good, but I couldn't actually hear very much of it, I won't be interested. If you can't hear me, now is the time to do something about it, not later. And I have no idea how these acoustics work, so please do act early if you can't hear me. It is the most frustrating thing, especially when you have a bad cold, to harangue people and then be told that they couldn't hear what you said. I am reminded, particularly by the vacant seats here for the Politburo, of my days as a Trotskyist, when the rules for meetings were quite simple. Always book a hall much smaller than the one you needed, so if nobody turned up it didn't look too bad, and if lots of people turned up it looked good. Start dead on time and turn the lights down so they couldn't see you properly. The problem with almost all the Trotskyist meetings I organised was the main speaker was a man called Tony Cliff, who had a considerable spittle problem, and therefore the unfortunate people in the front rows, particularly when he pronounced the word struggle, which he did rather often, would be quite badly showered. There is no danger of this kind this evening, so if any of you feel that you've sat too far to the back, now's the chance to move. Neither of us has any communicable disease. I will also, before I get really going, conduct a couple of small opinion polls. One of them is to ask you, please, to show your hands if you believe that cannabis should be, I will use the word decriminalised as a general word for all the various sneaky forms of legalisation which are being proposed. If you believe that the laws against cannabis should be weaker than they now are, will you please raise your hand? If you believe that they should remain the same, will you please raise your hand? If you think they should be more rigorously enforced and perhaps be harder than they are, will you please raise your hand? Good heavens, well there you are, it's going to be easy then. I was going to ask if any of you had a completely closed mind. Nobody ever puts their hand up for that, but you have to prove it. Now, it's a very simple proposition really. This drug, is it immoral? And why would a drug be immoral? As someone who has actually been criticised twice by interviewers in The Guardian and the Evening Standard for my coffee habit, I perhaps have to tread carefully here. How can I go around prescribing drugs that I disapprove of while inserting into my body the fiendish drug caffeine? I think most people can see from a fairly early stage what the fault with that is, but let me explain briefly. I do not think that caffeine in any way alters the consciousness of the person who ingests it. And this is the fundamental reason why one has to be suspicious of those things which come under the general name drug. What they do is to alter the consciousness. And that's one way of putting it, and in fact rather a polite way of putting it. The other thing that you could say they did was to distort the senses. Now, it doesn't really matter to me in this argument whether you're a religious believer who thinks either that we were created as we are, or that we are the result of millennia of directed evolution, or indeed you believe that evolution is entirely undirected and we are simply the extraordinary product of many, many thousands of years of natural selection. Whatever you think about the human body and its senses, you have to be able to see, I think, if you're remotely thoughtful, that the human brain, the eyes and the ears and the senses of touch are astonishingly intricate and wonderful things, and that their use in appreciating the astonishingly intricate world in which we live is a wonder in itself. Why would anybody think it right or good to distort the relationship between your senses and the world? It would seem to me to be, especially given, and a subject I'll come on to shortly, that by doing so you might permanently endanger the functioning of those senses. Why would you A, distort something which was good enough already, and B, risk something which was a very precious possession, which once lost could not be regained? Would this not be in the way of throwing a gift back into the face of whoever gave it to you, if you believe that somebody did, or destroying your own inheritance if you don't believe in that? So again, no particular moral system is necessary to see that the deliberate distortion of your senses is morally problematic at the very least. Then one moves on to the next part of this, which is very important to me because of a growing amount of experience that's been shared with me by readers of my column, by friends of mine, by people who get in touch with me all the time out of the blue, particularly about cannabis, and about the terrible effects that they confess that it's had upon them, or which they unhappily will reveal, generally only in private, has happened to their children. And those effects are in many cases extremely serious. And at all these meetings, I know that I'm here partly to plug my own book, but obviously that goes without saying, and it's in the way of business. But I have no pecuniary interest at all in promoting another book, which is not on sale here tonight, by my good friend Patrick Cockburn, probably the greatest foreign correspondent of our time, which on this occasion is not about Iraq or about any of the other areas where he risks his life, but about the awful experience of his son Henry, who took cannabis as a schoolchild between the ages of 11 and 14, and who following that, and I dare not say because of that, because I can't prove causation, but following that became seriously and irreversibly mentally ill in ways which I won't here describe, because you have to read this very moving account of the occasion, written mostly by Patrick, but to some extent by Henry himself, of what happened. And one of the things which has happened to Patrick since he published that book is that a very large number of his contemporaries have come to him and said, now that you've gone public about this, I can tell you of what has happened to my family, or to the children of my friends, or to my nephew. And there is an enormous amount of this. And he is in a state of near rage at the moment, with the number of people who say to him, oh, Patrick, this is just anecdotal evidence. He says, how many anecdotes does it take to make you wonder seriously about whether this could possibly be right? This leads me on to the next point. A large number of people in modern Britain seem to, especially in the universities and if they work for The Economist magazine, seem to have swallowed whole John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, in many cases without having read it. And they seem to believe that there is some rule which says, and it is actually the fundamental rule of modern society, and indeed the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth, and 10th commandments of the century of the self in which we now live. You can't tell me what to do with my body. I am sovereign over this thing, my body. Well, it doesn't take very much experience of life, which of course many of these people don't have, especially if they work for The Economist. It doesn't take very much experience of life to know that this is fundamentally untrue in a very important way if you have anybody who cares about you at all, and you do to your body something which damages it permanently and makes you dependent upon them, often in a very distressing fashion, then it is their business as much as it is yours. And the expression, no man is an island unto himself, has never been more true than it is for those who are damaged by actions which they have performed on their own bodies. Secondly, of course, there is for the more left-wing among you, if there are any of them, the simple point that people who make themselves dependent in this way also throw themselves upon the mercy of the state, which in many cases will be charged with their care until they die. So these simple points seem to me to argue that you should be very careful about the morality of taking drugs. There is another problem which arises among those who propagandize for the decriminalization of drugs. Very often they're doing this, it seems to me, in their own interests. They themselves either take drugs, have in the past taken drugs and don't wish to publicly confess or regret it, or permit their children to take drugs. And they think, indeed I know one who says it all the time, that it hasn't done them any harm. To which one always replies, well, how do you know what you would have been like if you hadn't? Particularly in the case of the person I'm thinking of, but I can't tell you who she is. But it is a problem here that what you have are people who are arguing for the legalization of, or the relaxation of the laws against a pleasure which benefits them, knowing, as I think any intelligent and literate person must know in our modern society, that if they get their way, other people will suffer as the price of their pleasure. I simply cannot see how to call for the relaxation of laws and a pleasure that you enjoy, knowing that other people will suffer very, very seriously as a result, can possibly be morally right under any code anyone could conceivably devise. I'll move on now to the brief case for the law. Now, one of the problems about the law is that, of course, it causes crime. If we had no laws, we would have no crime. We wouldn't have this tedious need for police officers or courts or prosecutions or prisons. We could simply say all these things go on, we may not like them, but we are prepared to tolerate them because we prefer that kind of society. We are perhaps libertarians who think that everyone should be allowed to live according to conscience, and if they won't, well then that's just tough. To an extent, 18th and early 19th century England was much like that. If you were burgled or robbed in 18th century London, if you wanted your goods back, you could probably get them back by paying a substantial fee to the person who stolen them from you in the first place. I believe this system is now being revived under the guise of car boot sales in many parts of England, but you'll have to tell me if that's true or not. The problem with this, addressed to crimes such as theft or violence against a person, is of course that it does save an awful lot of bother, and it doesn't bring, for instance, the mugger or the burglar into contact with criminals. If there are no criminals to come into contact with, they're not criminalised by this wicked law if they're allowed to burgle and sell your goods back to you. The problem is that burglary is very unpleasant for the victim, and so is robbery, and so is assault. And that is why we have laws against it. Now the question is whether the possession of drugs, which is the fundamental step which people take towards ingesting them, should be a crime of that nature. Or why should it be? Well, one of the reasons it should be is because of the deterrent effect of law on people who would otherwise do stupid things. Now, I am of an age that I can remember in the 1960s the very strong campaign which was waged by the law and indeed by government publicity against people who drank and drove cars. Now, there was initially quite a lot of resistance to this law. You could visit any saloon bar in southern England and hear people in blazers braying that 4 or 5 beers and a couple of whiskies never did them any harm. In fact, actually, old boy, I drive rather better with a few with a few brandies in my stomach. And as the law was being discussed and proposed, it was described as oppressive and interfering with the liberty of the subject and generally objected to. And you might have thought from that there would be great queues of people in blazers outside Her Majesty's prisons the moment the law was passed, waiting to be martyred for the right to drive while drunk. However, when the law was passed, what happened was something quite different. People stopped driving while drunk, and what's more, the person in the bar who said, actually, I'm not going to have another drink, was no longer pressed by his fellow drinkers. Oh, come on, old boy, it doesn't matter to have another. They understood that he had a serious, incontrovertible reason for not doing the stupid thing which they were urging him to do. And since the major danger of drugs in our society is actually to the young, not just because they're sold very, very widely in secondary schools and in some cases even in primary schools, but also because the young are most vulnerable to their effects, it is extremely important for the law to be able to say seriously, if you are caught in possession of these things, you will suffer, so that the person who comes under that deadly peer pressure to buy and take the dangerous drug cannabis has a defense. He can turn to his friends and say, no, one day I may want to live and work in the United States. One day I may want to do several things which I will be debarred from if I have a criminal record. It's foolish of me to do this, and if this is a believable statement, they will leave him alone, and he will be spared, and his parents will be spared, and many, many other people will be spared the terrible consequences of what would have happened had he done this immoral thing.
Okay, we come now to the response. Tim Wilkinson is somebody with a philosophy background, having studied at London and Oxford universities. He has a particular interest in epistemology and political philosophy and blogs at Surely Some Mistake. He's currently working on a book to do with philosophy and conspiracy theories, and the floor is his.